All right, part one, unit one of comparative government, topic one, the comparative method. So what we're going to be doing in this set of notes is going over what comparative politics is, why we compare political systems, and some of the political sciencey stuff surrounding the study of comparative government. Okay, first, it's important to distinguish international relations versus comparative politics. Um, what I went to school for as an international relations major was to study stuff like foreign policy, how countries decide whether they're going to be have diplomatic solutions to problems, or whether they're going to have or they're going to go to war and they're going to have like more violent solutions to problems. Studying the role of international organizations. And that's going to be kind of specific to an international relations degree. If you were to go to school for international relations, you're really going to be studying the relationship between countries. Comparative politics is a little bit different. What we're going to do is we're going to look at each of the 6 countries that we study, UK, China, Mexico, Nigeria, Iran, and Russia, and we're going to look at their election system and compare it to the United States. We're going to look at their political party systems, their parliamentary or presidential systems, look at how interest groups function and how their legislators and even their judicial branch function. The things that you have in common with international relations and comparative politics, some of the overlap studies, is the revolutions that occur in each of the countries or have occurred in each of the countries. You're going to compare political economic systems, so command economies versus market economies, and environmental politics and other current affairs. Now, why do we compare the governments? Look, everybody knows US is pretty awesome, but we don't always have all the answers. So sometimes you can find the answers in other political systems to make your system even better. Or you can even look at it like this. You can't really appreciate what you have until you compare it to other countries. So can we really appreciate our freedoms that we have in the United States until we compare them to more oppressive countries like China or Iran or Russia? It's a way to identify problems on the macro or micro scale, evaluate and understand how countries attempt to solve these problems, and again, learn from that. And then you can recommend the best solutions to the problems based on other countries' results. So if we're having a problem with healthcare in this country, then maybe we can look to the National Health Service and see if the UK has figured out how to provide good healthcare to their citizens. Maybe we can tweak what they do. So that's kind of how you would use comparative government, is to see what other countries are doing, see if they have it right, and see what they're getting wrong, and then be able to apply it. When you're studying comparative government, you look at, or any really political science, you have to look at statements. So there's 2 types of statements. There's empirical and there's normative. So empirical, these are going to be your simple factual statements that you can prove based on data. Okay. Empirical statement would be the United States has a higher GDP per capita than Nigeria. Okay, or the US has a GDP per capita of $54,000. A normative statement, we have to watch doing these because these are value judgments. These are going to be opinion statements, like African nations should look at European economic development strategies if they want to catch up and grow their GDP per capita. Now, when you're talking about statements and you're talking about social science, you're going to use that empirical data to try to make conclusions. So, of course, y'all know that a hypothesis is some kind of assumption that you have, or this idea that you have, and you have to work to prove that hypothesis. So it's important to distinguish the 2 types of hypothesis, like the 2 types of hypothesis and the hypothesis results. You have causation and correlation. Okay, so causation is that you can measure that one variable is dependent upon another variable, or one set of facts or data is caused by another. So you can look at it like this. Countries with high poverty rates have low literacy rates, and you can measure, you can point to high poverty rates and see that they are poor because they don't have a lot of education, and then they also have low levels of participation. That's all data that you can point to. So poverty is a dependent variable, and it's caused by the independent variable of low levels of education. It's all tested, and it's all testable, and it's backed by proof. So you can actually look at the education levels and notice that as education levels go up or down, so does poverty rates. Correlation is a little bit different. This is when one set of facts or data relates to another, but you're making assumptions here because things seem to relate, but it's not testable and it's not backed by proof. So when everybody says, you know what happens when you assume, that can happen when you're making correlations. So like you can make an assumption eating too much junk food causes you to be overweight. However, as high schoolers, y'all eat a lot of junk, and a lot of y'all are skinny. So that's just not necessarily a provable causation. Some people can eat junk food, and it doesn't affect their waistline. There's other things that have to be that play into it, like metabolism and the amount of exercise that you get. Okay, comparative approaches. Okay, we used to, when we looked at comparative government, there was an old way of doing it. The old approach was to look at it through three worlds. The United States and its allies, so the United States and other Western democracies. The second approach was the Soviet Union and their allies, so your communist countries, and then third world nations. So you would look at it like third world nations would be like looking at some of the poorer countries in Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America. But we're not really going to do that here. What we're going to really look at is democracy, like which countries are democratic or leaning more toward becoming democratic versus which countries are authoritarian. And we're also going to compare the economic systems, communist versus capitalist. And there's some other things that we have to take into account now that we're in a post-Cold War era, and it's not just as easy as looking at the United States and its allies versus the Soviet Union and their allies. There's more intricacies involved in comparing different political systems at this point. So we also will look at linkage institutions. So any of those institutions that link the people to government, like media, interest groups, elections, and political parties. The importance of political changes, looking a lot at revolutions, and integration of political and economic systems. Generally, people in a democracy will have an economic setup that is more mixed or market economy. Now, when we look at the different approaches to take into account, we will learn about advanced democracies, like the UK and the US. We'll look at communist and post-communist countries, which happen to be authoritarian, like China and Russia. And then we're going to be looking at newly industrializing countries and less developed countries, and that tend to be transitional democracies like Mexico and Iran and Nigeria. And that's really the take on what we're going to do when we look at comparative government. So this is where it all begins.